The hillside above Coates' land held water strangely, and Eliam Coates was the only man in the valley who seemed to notice. It was not a thing anyone could have pointed to on a survey map. The rock shelf halfway up the slope looked, to any passing eye, like any other outcrop of gray stone worn smooth by weather, the kind of ground a man walked past 100 times without a second glance. But Eliam had walked past it perhaps 1,000 times, and somewhere around the 800th he had begun to notice that after a hard rain, the water did not run off that shelf the way it ran off everywhere else. It lingered. Not long. A quarter hour, perhaps less. But long enough that a thin green line of moss had crept along the seam of the rock where the water pooled before finally giving up and trickling downhill. And that moss did not grow anywhere else on the exposed stone of the ridge. Eliam had first noticed it in the spring of his 22nd year, kneeling to retie a boot lace, and he had said nothing about it to anyone. He simply began watching the shelf the way another man might watch the sky. He took to walking the hillside after every rain that summer, sometimes with a hoe over his shoulder as an excuse, sometimes with nothing at all. He watched where the water gathered and where it refused to. He noticed that two other shallow depressions, lower on the slope, held water a little longer than the ground around them, though not so long as the shelf. He began, without quite deciding to think of the hillside not as a poor stretch of rock unfit for a well, but as a kind of shallow bowl, tilted, holding what little it was given for just a little while before letting it go. His father had died the autumn before, and in the dividing of the family's modest holdings, the hillside acreage had gone to Eliam almost as an afterthought. 11 acres of steep, rocky ground that no one else in the family wanted, because everyone knew a well could not be sunk there. The bedrock ran too close beneath the topsoil. 2 different well diggers had tried and failed on adjoining parcels, striking stone at 11 feet, where a man needed 30. The valley folk called it the worthless slope, and said it kindly, the way people speak of an ugly dog that isn't going anywhere. Eliam's older brother had taken the river bottom acres, black soil, and a good spring 20 steps from the cabin door. His sister's husband had taken the meadow with its 2 ponds. Eliam had said nothing when the hillside fell to him. He was not a man who argued about what he was given. He simply began, that same autumn, to walk it. It was his wife, Sarah, who first grew afraid of what she saw him doing. "You've been up on that ridge every evening this week," she said one night, setting bread before him that was thinner than it had been the week before. "Digging." "Not digging," Eliam said. "Marking." "Marking what?" He did not answer right away. He was not a man who explained himself before he was certain, and he was not yet certain, only curious in a way that had begun to feel like conviction. "Where the water wants to go," he said finally. Sarah did not laugh, though another woman might have. She had married a quiet man and had long ago stopped expecting him to speak more than the situation required. But she watched him with the particular worry of a woman who has watched drought take a valley before, and she did not sleep easy that night, because she understood before he said another word that he intended to build something on ground that had already refused 2 wells, and she did not see how a man could outstubborn bedrock. The notebook had belonged to Eliam's grandfather, Ezra Coates, and for 3 years after the old man's death it had sat in a trunk in the loft, unopened, because no one in the family had thought to look inside it. Ezra had been a strange, silent sort of man in his last years, given to long walks and longer silences, a man who had spent a decade of his youth in the dry country farther west before coming back east to marry and farm, and who had never spoken much of what he'd learned there. The family had assumed, without much thought, that whatever he'd carried back with him had died with him. Eliam found the notebook in October, looking for a hand plane he thought might be stored in the same trunk. The leather cover was cracked and the pages foxed with age, but the hand inside was careful, small, and dated across nearly 40 years. Most of it concerned ordinary things, planting dates, livestock ailments, weather observations recorded with the patience of a man who expected someone, someday, to need them. But near the back, under a heading that simply read the dry country, what I learned there, Eliam found 3 pages that changed the shape of his winter. "A hillside that holds no well may yet hold water," the first line read, "if a man does not fight the slope but bends to it." Ezra had written of a technique he'd seen practiced by farmers in the arid country, men who could not sink wells into rock, but who had learned instead to catch what fell from the sky and hold it against the dry months. He described a reservoir, not a pond, not a dam across a running stream, but a catchment built into the natural bowl of a hillside, fed by ditches cut along the contour of the slope to gather rain and snowmelt from a wide area and funnel it down into a single basin. The basin itself, he wrote, must be lined, or the water would simply seep away into the same rock that had defeated the well diggers. Line it with clay, puddled and beaten, the notebook read, 8 inches deep if the clay is good, a full foot if it is poor. Beat it wet with the flat of a shovel or the heel of a boot until it holds like leather. A basin so lined will hold water a full season, sometimes 2, before it wants relining. The second passage concerned the ditches themselves, what Ezra called catch trenches, cut not straight down the slope, where they would only hurry the water away, but along the contour, level or nearly so that rain falling anywhere on the hillside above would be caught and walked gently sideways and downward toward the basin rather than allowed to race off in a flood and vanish into the valley floor. A trench cut plumb with the slope's own level will catch 3 times the water of one cut carelessly, Ezra had written. I have seen it proved. The land does not give up its water easily. It must be persuaded, the way a stubborn animal is persuaded, not by force, but by knowing which way it already wants to go. The third passage was the shortest, and Eliam read it more times than the other 2 combined. Patience is the only tool this method truly requires. A well gives water in a day. This gives it in a season. Do not judge it by the well's clock. Eliam sat in the loft a long while after reading that, the notebook open on his knee, the last of the October light coming thin through the gable window. He thought of the shelf of rock where the moss grew, and the 2 shallow depressions below it, and understood, with the particular quiet certainty that comes to a man who has been circling a thing for months without naming it, that his grandfather had described, almost exactly, the shape of ground he already owned. He did not tell Sarah that night. He went out instead, in the last of the light, and stood on the hillside with the notebook under his arm, and looked at the shelf of rock a long while, the way a man looks at a face he is only beginning to recognize. He began the work in November, which Sarah thought was folly, because November gave a man only a few weeks before the ground closed up hard with frost, and because the notebook itself said the method wanted a season, not a month, and here was her husband trying to start it at the wrong end of the year with winter coming on. Why not wait for spring, she asked him, not for the first time, watching him sharpen a mattock by lamplight. Because the basin needs to be dug and lined before the spring rains come, Eliam said. If I wait for spring to start digging, the spring rains will have nowhere to go but away from us, same as always. It was sound reasoning, and Sarah could not argue against it, though she still did not sleep easy. He dug the basin first, a shallow bowl some 22 feet across and 4 feet deep at its center, set into the natural low point below the mossy shelf, where the 2 smaller depressions already showed the land's own inclination. The digging was hard, the ground half frozen by the time he'd gotten a third of the way through, and he worked most days alone, because Thomas Rule, his nearest neighbor on the hillside side, had his own late harvest to bring in and could only come by evenings. Thomas was not a talking man either, which suited them both. He would arrive after his own chores were done, take up a mattock without much greeting, and work until the light failed. It was Thomas who hauled the clay, 3 wagon loads of it from a cut bank along Miller's Creek 2 miles off, because the soil on Eliam's own hillside was too thin and stony to line a basin. It was Thomas who, without being asked, brought his ox to help drag the heaviest stones for the spillway wall, and who said, the first night the basin's shape was fully dug, only, it'll hold, if the clay's good, which from Thomas was as good as a blessing. The lining took the better part of 2 weeks. Eliam mixed the clay with water hauled up from the creek in barrels lashed to a sledge, worked it with his boots and the flat of a shovel exactly as the notebook instructed, beating it into the floor and walls of the basin in layers until it took on a dull, dense sheen, like the skin of some sleeping animal. He measured the depth of the lining with a notched stick, 8 inches where the clay was good and pliable, a full 12 where a vein of poorer clay had come up sandy from the cut bank. He kept a ledger of it in a scrap notebook of his own, a habit he'd taken up without quite deciding to, the way a man takes up his father's walk without meaning to. November 3rd, basin dug, 22 feet across, for foot center depth. November 9th, lining begun, clay from Miller's cut bank, 3 loads. November 21st, lining complete, depth 8 to 12 inches. Throughout. November 24th, first ditch cut, upper contour, 40 rods long. The dog did not like the basin. Tumble was an old, sensible hound who had never in his life shied from a hole in the ground. But from the first week of digging he refused to come near the pit's edge, circling it wide on his rounds of the property, years back. And on the evening the lining was finished, he stood at the rim a long moment with his hackles faintly raised before turning and trotting off without drinking from the puddle of rainwater already collecting in the bottom. Sarah noticed it and said nothing, but she noticed. Dogs don't like new-turned ground, Eliam said, when she finally mentioned it. He'll come around. He did not come around. Not that winter. And Sarah kept that fact somewhere in the back of her mind the way a woman keeps a small stone in her shoe. Not painful enough to stop walking, but impossible to entirely forget. The first real test came in December, with a slow 3-day rain that soaked the whole valley and left most low ground standing in puddles by the second evening. Eliam went up the hillside on the second morning to find his catch trenches carrying water exactly as the notebook had promised, a thin, steady sheet moving sideways along the slope, gathering itself rod by rod, spilling finally down a stone-lined chute into the basin. He stood in the rain a long while watching it, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a word for, something between relief and a kind of held breath. By the third morning the basin held perhaps 18 inches of water at its deepest point, and Eliam might have called it a triumph if he had not, walking the lower rim that afternoon, found a wet patch on the outer slope below the wall, water seeping through where none should have been. He dug a small test pit there and found it quickly enough, a section of the lining, perhaps 3 feet across, where the clay had dried too fast before he'd finished beating it, and had cracked in a fine web too small to see by eye, but plain enough once water found it. The basin was losing water there at what he judged, watching a marked stick over the course of an hour, to be nearly 2 inches of depth a day, water that would be gone entirely within a fortnight at that rate, undoing most of what 3 weeks of work had gained. He did not despair over it, though Sarah, coming up to bring him his midday meal and finding him kneeling in the mud with his hand pressed to the crack like a man feeling for a fever, thought for a moment that he might. "It's failed," she said, more a question than a statement, watching his face. "It's leaking," Eliam said. "Not the same thing." He recut the cracked section that same afternoon, working the old clay loose and mixing it fresh with new material hauled that day, packing it in wet and beating it harder and longer than before, 12 inches deep this time rather than 8, and covering the patch with a layer of straw to slow its drying so it would not crack again in the same way. He marked the date and the fix in his ledger. December 14th, leak found, west wall, approximate 2 in day loss. Patched with fresh clay, 12 inches. Depth, straw cover to slow cure. December 21st, leak stopped. Depth holding steady at 19 inches. The proof came a week later, small but unmistakable. After a light rain that added perhaps an inch to the basin. The water level held exactly where his marked stick predicted it should, no more loss than what a few days of ordinary evaporation would account for. Eliam stood at the rim that evening a long while, watching the water lie still and dark in the last light, and for the first time since October, he let himself believe, plainly and without qualification, that the thing would work. Winter passed into a spring that was, by the valley's usual measure, dry. It did not come all at once. That was the particular cruelty of it, Sarah thought. A single hard drought a man could brace against, the way he braced against a storm, but this crept in a week at a time, each week's rain a little thinner than the last, until by May the valley's regular wells had begun to show the strain, and by June 2 of them had gone from merely low to entirely dry, and the talk in the valley, which for years had been about crops and weather in the ordinary way, took on a different, tighter tone. Eliam kept his ledger through all of it, and it was the ledger, more than any words, that measured the shape of the season for him. May 2nd, reservoir depth 3 feet 4 inches. Held through dry April. May 19th, flour 40 pounds remaining. Cornmeal 60 pounds. June 6th, reservoir depth 3 feet 1 inch. No rain in 11 days. June 20th, flour 22 pounds. Cornmeal 30 pounds. Hogs down to 2. July 3rd, reservoir depth 2 feet 8 inches. Miller's Pond reported dry. July 15th, Flour, 9 pounds. Well, at the Hollis place gone dry. Sarah watched the numbers shrink alongside him. And it was in July, with the flour down to 9 pounds and no clear sign of when it might be replenished, that her fear finally found its voice. "You've put everything into that hole in the hillside," she said one night, not unkindly, but with the flatness of a woman who has done her sums and does not like the total. "If it fails now, in the worst of it, we have nothing left to fall back on." It hasn't failed. It's dropping every week. Same as every well in the valley is dropping. What makes you certain yours won't go the same way, only slower? It was a fair question, and Eliam did not have a ready answer for it, because in the quiet hours before dawn he had begun to ask it of himself. The basin's level was falling, week over week, exactly as she said, and though it was falling slower than the open wells around it, slower was not the same as safe, and he had begun, for the first time since October, to lie awake doing arithmetic he did not like the shape of. How many weeks of water remained at the current rate of loss, set against how many weeks until the autumn rains might reasonably be expected? And the two figures did not sit comfortably beside each other. He nearly gave it up in the last week of July. Not the reservoir itself. He could not have filled it back in if he'd wanted to. But the ditches, the daily discipline of walking the contour trenches to clear them of the leaves and silt that summer heat kept dropping into them. Work that took the better part of 2 hours each morning and had come, in the exhaustion of a hard season, to feel like effort spent for a diminishing return. He said as much to Thomas one evening, the two of them sitting on the basin's rim in the day's last heat, the water below them lower than either man liked to look at directly. "I've half a mind to let the trenches go," Eliam said. "Spend the mornings on something that shows a quicker result." Thomas did not answer right away. He was chewing a stem of grass and looking out over the valley, where in the distance a thin line of dust marked someone's wagon on the dry road. "Quicker result," Thomas said finally, "is how every well down there went dry. Men chasing a quick fix till there wasn't any water left to fix quick." He spat the grass stem out. "Your grandfather's book didn't say this was fast. Said it was patient. You knew that going in. Knowing it and living it aren't the same thing." "No," Thomas agreed. "They aren't." He stood, brushing off his trousers, and looked down at Eliam a moment. "But you cleared those trenches every morning for 8 months because you believed the land wanted to give you water that way. Land hasn't changed its mind. Only you have, and only because you're tired." He picked up his hat. Being tired isn't the same as being wrong. Eliam sat with that a long while after Thomas had gone. He did not clear the trenches the next morning either, sitting instead at the table with his grandfather's notebook open before him, reading again the line he had read 100 times since October. "Do not judge it by the well's clock." And something in the plainness of it, coming back to him now with 8 months of sweat behind it instead of none, settled the argument in him more firmly than Thomas's words had. He cleared the trenches the morning after that, and every morning after, through the worst of the dry. The first of the 3 came to his door in the last week of July. Widow Hale kept 11 head of stock on the small parcel below the ridge, and her own well, never a strong one, had gone dry a fortnight before. She came up the hillside path on foot, in the heat of early afternoon, and stood at some distance from the basin's rim before she could bring herself to ask, because asking was not a thing that came easily to a proud woman who had managed alone for 6 years. "I wouldn't ask," she said, "if there were anyone else to ask." Eliam did not make her explain further. He walked her to the basin, showed her the level marked on his stick, 2 feet 9 inches, down from 3 feet 4 in May, but holding, and told her plainly what he could spare and what he could not. Enough to water her stock twice a week if she hauled it herself. Not enough to spare for anything more, not with the season what it was. "I don't need more than that," she said, and something in her shoulders eased that had not eased in weeks. "Twice a week will see them through." She hauled her first 2 barrels down the hillside path that same afternoon, and Eliam noted it in his ledger without ceremony. July 26th, Hale, 2 barrels for stock. Level 2 feet 9 inches. The second came in mid-August, and this one Eliam had not expected. Josiah Pruitt ran the valley's grist mill, and his mill pond, fed by a small spring branch that had never in Josiah's memory gone dry, had that August finally given out entirely, leaving the mill wheels sitting idle above a bed of cracked mud. Josiah was not a man given to asking favors. He was, if anything, closer to the sort who had privately called the hillside acreage worthless in years past, though never unkindly. And he stood on Eliam's threshold that day with his hat in both hands, looking, Sarah thought, like a man who had walked a long way to eat a piece of pride he'd been carrying a good while. "I've grain backed up from 4 farms and no water to turn the wheel," he said. "I'm not asking for the pond's worth. I know you haven't got it. I'm asking whether there's enough to run a sluice down for an hour a day, 3 days a week. Enough to keep the wheel turning slow." Eliam took him up to the basin and showed him the same marked stick, 2 feet 3 inches now, the driest week of the whole season behind it, the driest likely still ahead. He did the arithmetic aloud, the way his ledger had taught him to, weighing what an hour's sluice 3 days a week would cost against what remained, and what he judged the season still owed them before rain came again. "I can give you that," he said finally. "Not more." Josiah nodded, and did not offer thanks in words, which was not his way, but he sent his boy up 2 days later with a sack of milled flour left silently on the porch, and Sarah, finding it, understood it as the closest thing to gratitude the miller knew how to give. August 14th. Pruitt, sluice 1 her day, 3 dasic, for mill. Level 2 feet 3 inches. The third came at the end of August, and it was the hardest of the 3 to bear, because it was Hattie Weller who came, carrying her youngest boy, for years old and fevered, and it was not water for stock or a mill wheel she needed, but clean water for a sick child. The well at her place having gone brackish and foul as it dropped low, the kind of water that made a fever worse instead of better. Eliam gave her what she needed without weighing it first, and only afterward, alone, did the arithmetic of it settle over him. Because clean water given freely to a sick child was not water he could measure out twice a week the way he had with Widow Hale's stock. He noted it plainly in the ledger, without excuse. August 29th. Weller, water for the boy's fever. Given freely. Level 2 feet 1 inch. The boy's fever broke 3 days later. Hattie did not come to say so in person. She was not a woman for visiting in the ordinary way. But word of it passed down the valley the way word of such things always did, and it reached Eliam's second hand, from Thomas, who mentioned it as if it were no great matter, though both men understood that it was. The reservoir's level bottomed out in the first week of September at 1 foot 8 inches, the lowest it had been since the basin first held water in December, and low enough that Eliam, marking the stick that morning, felt for the first time in the whole long season something closer to fear than doubt. But the autumn rains, when they came the way autumn rains in that valley usually did, gathering first in a string of overcast days, and then breaking, on the 11th of September, into a steady 2-day soaking that filled the catch trenches to their brims and sent a full, unbroken sheet of water down into the basin for the better part of 40 hours. Eliam went up in the rain both mornings to watch it, the way he had that first December test, and by the second evening the marked stick showed 3 feet 6 inches, higher than the basin had held all summer, higher even than its December start. Sarah came up with him on the second evening, standing at the rim in a light rain that had softened to little more than mist, watching the water lie dark and full below them. Tumble had come too, and for the first time in nearly a year the old dog walked to the very edge of the basin and drank from it, unhurried, before lying down in the wet grass nearby with the particular contentment of an animal that has finally decided a place is safe. Sarah watched him do it a long moment before she spoke. "I doubted you," she said. "All spring and half the summer, I doubted you." "You had cause to," Eliam said. "It looked, most weeks, like a thing worth doubting. It still might have failed. Another dry week, too, and it would have." "Might have," Eliam agreed. He did not argue the point, because he had lain awake with the same arithmetic she had, and he was not a man to pretend the margin had been wider than it was. "It didn't, though." She slipped her hand into his, the two of them standing there in the last of the mist, and neither said anything further for a while, because there was nothing further that needed saying. Below them the basin held its new depth, dark and quiet, and somewhere off down the slope a wagon creaked along the road toward the mill, where the wheel, Eliam knew without needing to check, was turning again on water that had once been called useless. By October the valley's talk had shifted, the way valley talk does, from the drought itself to what had gotten people through it, and Eliam's name came up in that talk more than he was entirely comfortable with. Men who had called the hillside worthless the autumn before now stood at his fence line asking careful questions about clay and contour lines, trying to work out, in their own roundabout way, whether a man might cut a similar catchment on his own poor ground without quite admitting he'd been wrong to laugh the first time. Eliam answered them plainly, the way his grandfather's notebook had answered him, and turned away no man who asked in earnest. He kept his ledger going into the new season, the numbers steadier now, the crisis of the summer settling into the ordinary rhythm of a working reservoir. Rain in, use measured out, the level rising and falling with the weather the way a well-tended thing should. He added a line to the ledger that October, not a measurement this time, but the kind of note his grandfather might have left for whoever came after him. A well answers in a day. This answers in a season. Both are honest water, but only one asks a man to trust what he cannot yet see. He did not build anything grander that autumn, no wider basin, no second reservoir, though more than one neighbor suggested it. He simply kept clearing the trenches each morning, kept marking the stick, kept the ledger in his own small hand the way his grandfather had kept his, and when Thomas asked him once, half in jest, whether he meant to call the place anything now that half the valley had taken to calling it Coates Reservoir, without being asked, Eliam only shook his head. It was never mine to name, he said. I only waited long enough to see what it already was. The moss still grew along the seam of the mossy shelf above the basin, the same thin green line that had first caught his eye 2 years before, and some evenings, when the work was done and the light was going gold over the ridge, Eliam would climb up to stand beside it a while, not for any purpose, only to look down at the still water below and remember that the whole of it, the digging, the cracked clay, the thin flour tins, the dog who would not drink, the wife who had feared for good reason, had begun with nothing more than a patch of ground that held water a little longer than it should have, and a man patient enough to wonder why. Nothing worth keeping, his grandfather's notebook said in its very last line, ever filled in a single season. The land gives on its own clock, not on ours, and the only craft in catching what it gives is learning, finally, to wait as long as it asks.